and finish up our last session. Thank you very, very much for your patience. Let me start by reading this quote to you out of a book called How to Go On Living When Someone You Love Dies. Grief is not just sadness or depression. It is a whole host of emotions ranging from anger to anxiety to guilt to confusion to relief and more. Besides affecting your emotions, it reaches into every part of your life, touching your work, your relationships with others, and your image of yourself. You can expect grief to have an effect on you psychologically, socially, and physically. Now, something that so dramatically affects you is going to be putting you in a phase of your life where you need to be extremely careful about making big decisions. You have probably heard people say, boy, don't make any decisions. Give yourself at least a year or maybe 2 years before you make any big decisions, like relocating, for instance, to another city or state, or maybe even relocating in regard to moving out of your house to another house, or buying a new car or something like that. People often will caution us to be careful because it is a very uniquely emotional time in our life. Well, decisions don't become much bigger than the decision to be married, and that's certainly something we should be careful about after we've lost our mate. But shouldn't we be careful about that when we choose to marry the first time? We're missing that in our culture. We really are. And some of us who are older and some of us who have experienced marriage, and especially marriage and loss, maybe we ought to use our influence to help cultivate people's thinking about marriage and cause them to value it more. In our culture, marriage is not respected and honored as it ought to. I remember when I first started going to church, and then because of that started attending a few wedding ceremonies, I remember the officiant at the wedding ceremonies using some terminology like, marriage is not something to be entered into lightly. I haven't heard that phrase for years. Marriage is not something to be entered into lightly. In other words, it's something that we really need to be thinking about before we make that big leap and that decision. Well, that's true the first time, and it's true any other time afterwards. Marriage after loss can be awesome. In the Magnolia Messenger, spring of 2021, there was an article entitled, "Holding Another's Hands After the Passing of Your Mate." It is such a cool article. It's about these 6 people, individual Christians, who each lost their mate, and now they are 3 couples. And it tells you a little bit about their story. It's a really beautiful story. When I started seeking information about this, I sent an email to a friend of mine, Travis, and Travis responded this way. Among other things, he said, "My dad died in January of 2013. There was a man at Mom's church whose wife died the day before my dad died. He took care of his wife for 12 years. I performed the wedding ceremony for Bob and my mom last April. Mom is 88 and he is 78. Isn't that neat? Bill and Burl, I met them at the Woodson Chapel Church in Nashville, Tennessee. Bill and Burl both had long and happy marriages. Bill's wife got ovarian cancer, and Burl's husband got Parkinson's disease, and he had it for 10 years. Both of them were faithful caregivers to their mates, but then eventually, of course, lost their mates. And they both experienced the deep grieving and that grief journey that's so difficult. Neither one of them had thoughts of remarrying. Now you probably know where this story is going. After 14 years of being alone, Bill's son said to his dad, "Dad, why don't you ask Burl out on a date?" Well, Bill thought about it for a while, and he'd been alone for for 10 years. He decides to call Burl, and he was surprised when she said yes. He said after that, I didn't know what to do. What do I do now? He had never experienced this for decades in his life. Well, they started spending some time together. And here's the way that Burl ends this handwritten story that she shared with me. After dating a while and falling in love, we married. Our lives are so much happier. God's work can now be done together. I was in Medina, Ohio, and at the end of a workshop, I had this lady come to me, and she was smiling, just grinning like a Chessy cat, and then she told me her story, and I said, oh, you got to send me an email. I can't remember all of this. So here is a little bit about her story. She lost her husband in 2012. She'd been married for 38 and a half years. He lost his wife in 2013, and he'd been married for 40 years. Now, what's really weird about this story is this is in Ohio, in a time in their life, decades ago, when they were young adults in another state, they were members of the same church. She remembered that, but him being a clod, he didn't remember. So here they are now, decades later, in another church in Medina, Ohio. So they end up calling a speaking to one another kind of relationship before and after church. And then this happened. We met after Wednesday night Bible study at a local McDonald's. I was so nervous, I was shaking with my coffee in hand. We had a really nice talk that night. And then we chatted a few times on the phone, and then we went out together for dinner. It was a date. She has in parentheses, he picked me up. Now that's one of the funny things about male-female relationships after loss. And I talk about this with some other people. In Middle Tennessee, there's this lady that I'd been out to eat with twice at a restaurant in Franklin, Tennessee, which is south of Nashville. And previous to us meeting twice at this restaurant, we had had occasional telephone conversations. And one time during the course of the conversation, I said, now wait a minute, Carla. I said, define for me what a date is, in your opinion. She said, he picks me up and he pays the bill. Okay, now, remember that story. Twice we met at a restaurant in Franklin, Tennessee. Both times I picked up the bill and we walked to the cashier. I turned to her and both times said the same thing. Carla, this is not a date. I'm paying the bill, but you drove here and we met here. I did not pick you up. In West Tennessee, when we were doing those widowhood fellowships monthly, there was one time we had over 40 people there, and we were talking about male-female relationships after loss. And I asked that big group, I said, what's a date? This one lady raised her hand and said, he picks me up, he pays the bill, and I get a kiss. I threw up my hands and I thought, okay, obviously, sometimes two people can be out and have a human experience together. One views it as a date, and the other is clueless. Usually it's the man that's clueless. He doesn't see it as a date, and she does. But anyway, she said, it was a date because he picked me up. Then she said, he had to go to Arkansas to be with family for a while. While he was there with family in Arkansas, she ended up in the hospital, and she's diagnosed with cancer. She said, I knew what was going to happen then. I was going to lose him. And then she talks about how that he chose to be by her side. When she was puking her guts out and had no hair, he was right there with her. They ended up getting married. And here's what she says in this email at the end. I never thought I could love someone else, and neither did he. Beautiful stories. But this is not an easy thing to deal with. I'm going to share with you a part of an email from Diane Shovstall. This was 2.5 years after she lost her husband. Her husband died a month before my wife died. And the circumstances of her husband's death was on a Sunday morning. She was cooking breakfast. They had 2 teenage children. She got married when she was 19 years old. He was 23, and they were married for 23 years. And this Sunday morning, she sent a teenage daughter down to get her dad for breakfast, and the teenage daughter found her father dead on the floor. And so this is 2.5 years later. Diane shares this with me. It scares me to think about the whole thing of dating and just starting over. I'm not sure if I could love someone again like I loved Gary. I'm very lonely and I miss his companionship every day. We talked about it before, if something were to happen to one of us, how that we would want the other to remarry. It was easy to say that when he was here. Now that he's gone, it's much more difficult to talk about this. I would like to be able to love again, but I'm not sure that my heart is ready or is able to handle it again. It also scares me. It scares me because I know that if I get remarried, if the spouse goes before me again, I don't want to have to live through the pain of losing another spouse. You see how this can be challenging? Sometimes it doesn't work out as well as some of them I shared with you at the beginning of this session. There's John and Effie, who both lost their spouses. They ended up marrying one another. And what Effie found out was she had reason for regret. She found out he was a control freak. She complained that he even monitored her television watching. And so that was upsetting to her. She didn't even have the freedom to watch the television shows she wanted to watch. So here she is married and she's regretting it. And then Effie gets dementia. And so John says to a widowed friend of his, who's also a friend of mine, John says, I did not get married to care for somebody. I got married for somebody to care for me. That reminded me of a few sentences in a book that I used to use in premarital counseling. And here's the quote out of that book. The most miserable people in the world are not single people who want to be married, but married people who realize their marriage is a mistake. The most miserable people in the world are not single people who want to be married, but married people who realize their marriage is a mistake. Sometimes marriage after loss can be an awful mistake. It didn't get much worse in my research than this. A public Facebook post by a lady who is the daughter of a shepherd in the Lord's church. And here's what she posted. Dear Facebook friends, I don't normally write very personal posts, but because most of my Facebook friends are like family to me, I want to tell you about the recent events in my life. I know some of you have been very concerned, and I appreciate that more than you know. It's hard to talk to everyone all the time, so maybe this post will answer some questions and elicit some prayers. Please know that this is difficult for me to write, but I feel like I can make everything clear. I'm just ashamed that I made such an impulsive decision. As most of you know, my husband Jim passed away in June of 2014. It forever changed my life. I was vulnerable, devastated, and naive. I met someone months later and we were married July of 2015. June of 2014, July of 2015. While that may seem very quick, at the time I could not see it. I was lonely and should have never remarried so quickly. I don't want to go into all the details on Facebook, but after several rounds of heartache with this person, we are now divorcing. Being a teacher in the same town for 25 years lends itself to knowing a lot of people. I'm taking back Jim's last name. He was the love of my life as I move forward from this very embarrassing situation. Now watch this last statement. You know me, and you know all that I've ever wanted was a loving marriage like many of you have. It's a very natural thing to desire a loving marriage like we see many other people have. How do you deal with that when you have had to deal with the loss of the person that was the most precious person on earth to you? And here you've been shaken to your core, and you've been struggling with something that may be the greatest struggle in your life, the most severe storm of your life ever. How in the world do you navigate that experience of intermingling with the opposite gender again, and then thinking about the possibility of being married again? So in that book, After the End Comes, there's 3 chapters, back to back to back, that go like this. Male-female relationships after loss. And I make a confession in that section of the book. I considered all women forbidden fruit. And I explain why in that book. I don't consider them forbidden fruit any longer, but I needed to for the first few years. So the one chapter deals with male-female relationships after loss. The next chapter deals with sex after loss. When have you ever sat in a Bible class where there's been a discussion about a Bible topic, sex, after loss? And then there's a chapter about marriage after loss. In the Widowhood Workshop ministry, what we try to do is we try to help people with their life after loss and try to educate people about some things that will help them to navigate their life after loss wisely, where they can have still a meaningful, great life after their loss. Now, the U.S. Census Bureau has done some research. And here's what the research indicates about marriage after loss. The U.S. Census Bureau shows that half of all marriages after loss, if they get married within 2 years of their loss, over half of those marriages end in divorce. Now that blew me away when I read it, because in my naivete, here's what I was thinking. I've suffered loss. Previous to that, I had 41 years of marriage, and I've suffered loss. I thought that that would be a great bit of experience to help me to be even a better husband the second time around. And I still feel that way. I think if I were ever to marry again, I will be a better husband the second time around because of my 41 years with my first wife, and because of the fact I lost her, and I know what it's like to live after the loss of that precious blessing of marriage. And then if she had had that same experience, you take 2 people with the valued experience of marriage and the valued experience of loss, you would think they would bring into that relationship a boatload of wisdom that would help with the marriage. But sometimes what happens, what we human beings will do, is we'll self-medicate. Sometimes a person with clinical depression will self-medicate with alcohol or some other drug, prescription drug or illegal drug. They'll self-medicate. They're not going to the right source for help. Sometimes we think in our loneliness and in our grief, what's going to help me feel better is if I get to be a wife again, or if I get to be a husband again. If I'm married again, then I won't feel like this anymore. Well, no, that's not marriage's design. So we need to talk about marriage, and we need to talk about marriage after loss. There's no doubt about that when you've lost your spouse, you have the right to remarry. Now, there is a phrase at the end of this verse, to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Now, how have you known that phrase to be understood in regard to that person? Only in the Lord. If it refers to the person, what does that say about that person? he'd be in the Lord. He had that simple trusting faith. He was baptized into Christ. That's how you get in the Lord. Simple trusting faith, turning away in penitence, baptized into Jesus Christ, in the Lord. Now, there's another way that phrase could be taken. It could be taken to refer to the marriage, not the person. In other words, that this is a marriage that is within the Lord's perspective legitimate. Now, again, this is something that's kind of hard in our culture to appreciate and understand, but not everybody has the right to be married to everybody else. Does anybody remember what ended up causing John the Baptizer to lose his head? What did he have the gall to say to Herod? It is not lawful for you to have her, your brother's wife. And then there was the woman at the well in John chapter 4. Why don't you go get your husband? I've had 4 husbands. Jesus said, and the man you now have is not your husband. Now, I'm not going to get into all the high weeds involved in how we human beings can mess things up. But I simply cite those 2 to prove, I think, unequivocally, that there are some people who don't have any business being married to some people. Maybe that phrase is what this has to do with. Maybe it has to do with the marriage, that the marriage is legitimate, that you have a right to be married, the other person has a right to be married, it's okay for the 2 of you to be married to one another. Or the phrase has reference to the person. Now, I'm not going to stake my soul's welfare on either perspective. Here's what I have a tendency to do. This is just the way I think. Why not embrace both? For years in my ministry, I chose not to perform wedding ceremonies where I would be helping a Christian be married to a non-Christian. Not because I thought it was sinful, because I don't. I will defend the right of a Christian to marry somebody who's not a Christian. But I think it's serious soul gambling. I wouldn't do it, and I don't want to publicly condone or encourage that sort of thing. I'll buy a gift for those couples. I'll do premarital counseling for those couples. I'll do marital counseling for those couples. I'll invite them over to my home. I will embrace their marriage. I just don't want to publicly officiate at that ceremony. Marriage is hard enough being married to a Christian because the Christian is a flawed human, and I'm a flawed human. So why not make sure that that person is a child of God and that you have a right to be married to that person and that that person has a right to be married to you? I love this in-your-face comment made by somebody who's on Facebook. She spells her name A-N-N-A-H. I guess that's another way of spelling Anna with an H at the end. Here's something she said. If a man isn't following God, he isn't fit to lead. Without a relationship with Him, He won't know how to have a relationship with you. I thought that was an interesting observation. Einstein, who's a marriage and family therapist, Elizabeth Einstein, says the most critical key for remarriage is that you resolve or mourn these things in your past, whether that be a divorce or whether it be the loss of your spouse. I think she's spot on. What do you think about this? You have to be okay on your own before you can have a healthy relationship with another person. Let's assume for a minute that there's 2 people here and we're at their wedding ceremony. There's a male and a female. Now, both of them are flawed human beings. Now, let's say the woman, she has an eating disorder. Okay, she has an issue, an eating disorder. Now, when she says, I do, is she still going to have that eating disorder? Sure she is. Now, let's say the man, let's be nice, and we're going to call him very disorganized. Okay? He has no problem leaving his dirty clothes on the floor, and a very disorganized kind of a person. And let's say he's late all the time. Now, he says, I do. Is he going to be on time all the time and always put his dirty clothes in the hamper? No. When we get married, what we do is we bring our personal issues, our baggage, into that relationship. Now, if the only way you're going to be okay is to be with that other person, what does that say about you, and what does it say about your relationship with the Lord? If the only way you can be okay is to be with that other person, what does that say about you personally and your relationship with the Lord? Now, in the first century, the Apostle Paul, by the inspiration of God, even encouraged younger widows to marry, to bear children, to manage the household. So this is certainly something that's okay to do, and it's permissible to do, but could we at least say that passage back in 1 Corinthians 7, can we at least say, if we don't agree on what only in the Lord means, can we at least agree that it's a cautionary flag? A cautionary flag. A be careful kind of caution flag. You're not the person you used to be. No human being goes through a crisis without being changed. When you experience a crisis in your life, you're changed by it. You become a different person to some degree in different ways. It doesn't get much more of a crisis than the loss of your spouse. So what about that person? That person that you are afterwards, are you fit to be married? And are you marrying somebody who is fit to be married and to be married to you? That's a pretty heavy thing. Now, in Philippians chapter 4, we're very familiar with this passage of Scripture. Now, do you have a problem with contentment in your life? Or am I the only one? Now, that's a pretty strong statement up there. How do you get contentment? Is there a prescription the doctor gives that you go to CVS and fill and you get contentment? Are you born with it? Do you get it by osmosis? That's the only thing I remember out of biology class. Do you put it under your pillow and then it goes through your pillow into your brain and into your heart? How do you get contentment there in that passage? How do you get it? Oh, you got to learn. You got to learn it. You got to learn it. Now, how many of us would admit that learning is painful? Sometimes, about some things, learning can be painful. Now, also, one of the frustrating things is learning takes time too, right? I hated geometry class. Was such a challenge in 10th grade. Some of you probably had your issues with learning, okay? The idea of contentment is in Philippians chapter 4. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Now that is a very strong statement. And I really, again, until my wife died, I didn't reflect enough on this passage. And what a strong statement that is. What an inspiration he was. He said, I have learned in whatever, that's a universal statement, whatever state I am, to be content. He says in verse 12, I know how to be abased, I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things, I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That last verse in verse 13 is often taken out of context. He's talking about, when he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, he's talking about his ability to be content in whatever human, fallen world, life circumstance he is in. By the strength that Jesus Christ gives him, he can be content. Now I'm going to plug in some words here, and I'm going to ask you, let's think about this in a real personal way. I have learned in whatever financial, let's plug the word financial in, whatever financial state I am, to be content. Is that possible? Is it possible in whatever financial condition you're in to be content? How in the world could that be possible? You learn it, and how do you learn it? Through Christ who strengthens you. Now, let's get real personal here. How about physical state? Whatever physical state I am, to be content. Can an amputee who's a diabetic be content? Can a cancer patient who's lost all their hair and is struggling with weakness be content? The answer is yes. Through Christ who can strengthen us. But that is a hard thing to do. It's something that has to be learned. Learning takes time. Learning takes effort. Learning takes focus. As people striving to be mature Christians, our contentment needs to be cultivated where it hangs on one thing and only one thing. Not our financial state, not the geographic state we live in, not our age, not our physical health, but on Jesus Christ. In a fallen world, the only thing that can help us to be content in every circumstance is Jesus Christ. That's what Paul is saying when he says, I can do all things through Christ. I can experience all things. I can live in whatever circumstance there is this side of eternity through Jesus Christ who strengthens me. It's not easy. Some people have asked me, as if I were some sort of an expert, and I'm not. Well, when do you think it's a good time to be remarried? And I know what they're wanting. They're wanting a number. They're wanting a number of years. They're wanting a number of months. In some cases, a number of weeks. And I can't give that. Some people remarry and have happy marriages after a few months. Cheryl Wayne and I have known some of those people. You know, we can put you in contact with those people. We can also put you in contact with people who've gotten remarried who are living a train wreck. It can be a very difficult thing. Life after loss, and especially the consideration of a second marriage. Some of them work out great, and some of them not so great. When is the best time for a person to remarry? Let me tell you how I respond when people ask me that question. Now, I realize that this is something that we don't talk about typically in the church. I've never heard anybody say this, except me. I think the best time, the most fitting and appropriate time for a widowed person to remarry is when they've struggled with their loss to the point that they're content in their widowhood. Now, it took me, I'm a slow learner, it took me a few years to get to that point. I would be okay with remarrying. But if our contentment is going to hang on that second marriage or third marriage or whatever, what does that say about our relationship with the Lord and our faith and our contentment? If it hinges on a human relationship and not on our relationship with the Lord, what does that say about our faith? I think the best thing to do is to work on our relationship with the Lord. Boy, I'll tell you what, I never prayed as passionately as I prayed until my wife died. I pray a lot differently now than I used to pray. I pray about a lot of different things now than I used to pray when my wife was living. But struggling with that loss, exercising your faith, cultivating that relationship with the Lord where that is the most meaningful thing to you, doing that helps you to become more fit to be married to someone else. What should be considered before a person gets married? And by the way, these are great things to tell your children and your grandchildren. Let me suggest to you that there are myths about marriage. There are things that people have embraced in our culture that are not true, but yet they've been married based on this kind of thinking. Let me give you some examples. For instance, the Hybels have written a book called Fit to be Tied, and in that book they have a chapter where they talk about myths about marriage. Marriage will end my loneliness. Marriage will heal my brokenness. Will it do that? If you're a broken person and you say, I do you become not a broken person? Marriage does not heal your personal brokenness. The Lord can heal your brokenness. And then what about this whole business of marriage will ensure my happiness? Do you know any unhappily married people? I mean, come on. Let's get real here. We all know people who are unhappily married. And marriage is God's plan for everyone? No, it's not. Do you know there are about 500,000 people in our country who've never married? What's wrong with them? The answer to the question is nothing. Marriage is not. I guess my suspicion is probably all of us know some people who've never married. It's just not for everybody. It just doesn't always work out for everybody. There are myths that we need to make sure that we don't embrace if we're going to have a good marriage. Here is the most valuable part of a marriage, whether it's a first one or some after. Let me tell you about the lady in Huntington, Tennessee, who came to me, and she said, when she introduced herself, she said, I've been widowed 3 times. She could tell from my physical reaction to that I was shocked. But here's what she said right after that. Having seen my reaction, and obviously knowing I was shocked, here's what she said. And I had 3 wonderful Christian men in my life. That's gratitude for the blessings of the Lord. But she lost those blessings 3 times. Spiritual compatibility is the most important part of marriage. I want to marry somebody who loves somebody else more than me. His name's Jesus. I don't want anything to do with anybody in regard to marriage. I don't want anything to do with any female in marriage unless she loves the Lord more than me. You take a person who loves the Lord more than anybody else and anything else, and then somebody else of the opposite gender who loves the Lord more than anybody or anything else, and that is spiritual compatibility. I read a book, and I shared it with Cheryl Wayne. He read the book as well, and he shared it with a niece of his. It's called Finding Your $1 Million Mate. Now, that is a great book, by the way. But the one problem with that book is I would have written the first chapter. And that first chapter would have been something like this. The first step toward finding the $1 million mate is you become a prospective $1 million mate. The person in the mirror. You know, if we find the $1 million mate, but we're not a $1 million mate, we're not a good match. What we need to do is make sure that we develop a devotion to the Lord and a walk with the Lord that's so intimate and so deep, and we have such dependence on Him, then we can find ourselves in a position where we would be a wonderful person to be married to. Spiritual compatibility, there's nothing more important than that. Time is the acid test of relationships. You know what that girlfriend of mine hid from me? Now, you got to remember, this is late 60s and early 70s. 19, not 1800s. She wouldn't let me see her in curlers, hair rollers. Some of you younger people would have to Google that. After I said I do, I had to sleep with her with those things in her hair. What do we do when we initially meet people? We put our best foot forward, don't we? That's what we all do. We want to make a good first impression. Over time, though, we start loosening up and becoming more real. What is this person like when they get angry? How do you find that out? Or what is this person like whenever they experience tension? How do they deal with stress? What does this person think about money, and how do they handle their money? How do you learn about all that stuff? Over time. Because over time you have experiences with those people and you begin more and more to see, but I know what people are wondering. How much time? I don't know. That's up to you. But I'm just saying it's something that we need to take time to figure out who that other person is and maybe figure out who I am in my relating to that other person. And then their families. Families are such a blessing, but the blending of families can be very difficult. I finished in Carthage, Missouri, and a guy came up to me. He stuck out his hand, he shook my hand, and he said, I think I've got a problem. And he started then talking about his daughter, who was very much against him getting married again. He's either 80 or 81 years old. What about your family and the blending of your family? Would you get married if you had children who were opposed to you getting married again? Or especially getting married to that particular person? Boy, there can be some serious family discussions in these kinds of cases. And this can be very complicated. And sometimes it can become complicated because of money, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. You've got these expectations from the past. You know, all of us have past experiences, especially in regard to marriage. Now, if you get married a second time, you're going to have some natural expectations of that person being like your former spouse. Well, what if that person, well, they're not going to be, so don't expect it. What if that person was not like your former spouse? They're not going to be. So what are the expectations? You have to have these transparent conversations. A lot of talking about a lot of different kinds of things. And you need to talk very openly about these things. If you want to have, I use intimacy in the sense of closeness. If you want to have closeness or intimacy in relationships, be transparent. Be honest, be forthright. Don't hold anything back. Including things that had to do with your health and thoughts about sexual relationships. Those things need to be talked about. One of the great things that me and this woman you're going to help me find for me is we're going to have this date, and you can even tell her ahead of time before you introduce her to me, that we're going to go to a candy store and a flower shop and buy some candy and flowers, and we're going to walk hand in hand, and we're going to go to her doctor. We're going to give her doctor the candy and the flowers. We're going to have her doctor tell us about her health. And then we're going to go to Walmart and buy a Zebco rod and reel and some tackle. And we'll take that to my doctor. It's very romantic. This is going to be very romantic. We're going to go to my doctor, and he's going to tell us about my health. That's my cute little lighthearted way of talking about being transparent about your health. You know, sometimes this stuff is hidden. Sadly, it's hidden. Imagine marrying somebody that you didn't know had a health problem that was hidden. Imagine the feeling of being trapped in a relationship like that. This can get so complicated with the finances. Now, this woman that you're going to help me find. Now, by the way, did I mention she's drop dead gorgeous? Okay. And by the way, if you want to call me, my number is BR549. Does anybody remember whose number that is? Junior Samples Used Car Lot. Okay. You can call that number and get me connected with her. Okay. What was I talking about? Oh, money. Okay. She's drop dead gorgeous, and she's a millionaire. Okay. I'm going to shoot for the sun, moon, and stars. Okay. She also has, by the way, 3 sons for the sake of describing this. We get married, and she ends up dying first. I have 3 daughters. Are her 3 sons going to have to share half of their third with my 3 daughters? Now, let's say we get married and I die first. I've been a preacher all my life. I leave behind $1.50. Are my children going to have to give a quarter to each one of her sons if I die first? See how complicated this gets? It really is complicated. And these things have to be discussed very openly. And a lot of times, I can't believe I'm saying this, we came up with this crazy thing of prenuptial agreements. That is about as stupid a thing as we have ever come up with in our culture. I have always said that that's like programming your marriage for failure. But having said that, in some of these kind of situations, I can see a prenuptial agreement being something that might calm down an adult child who thinks that their inheritance is at risk. Now, their inheritance is not their inheritance until we die. It's not their inheritance, but in their head it is. So maybe that might be something to consider, and I can't believe I'm saying that. But it's just a very difficult thing that has to be talked about. Again, nothing can be hidden. And where are you going to live? Which house are you going to live in? Or are you going to live in both houses? Or are you going to burn both houses down, collect the insurance money, and go build one of your own? You know, what are you going to do? You've got to talk about that ahead of time. That's not something to be talked about after. The point that I'm trying to make is there are risk factors. In human relationships, whether it's a friendship or whether you birth a child into this world, there are always risks in human relationships. You cannot eliminate human relationship risks, but you can reduce them. In marriage, the way you reduce the risks is you do your homework beforehand. You transparently talk about and find out about a lot of the stuff that I've just mentioned. Think about how fewer divorces we would have in our world if our young people, if our young adults did their homework before they ever said, I do. Imagine how much better the general state of marriages would be. It's a precious blessing. It's something that we ought to consider naturally because we're human beings, but yet at the same time, it's a challenge when we're talking about a remarriage. And I conclude with this. At midlife or later, it's somewhat like the merger of two major corporations. Be wise in what you are doing. Sprint and T-Mobile now are one. There was a lot of time and effort that went into that before that merger. Sometimes two corporations will do a lot of study and then they'll back off from a merger. They'll call it off because they see some red flags. I think that's a good approach in regard to a marriage after loss. We ought to be careful about those sorts of things. I hope that I've done enough to spur some thinking, maybe some conversation with some other people. I hope there's been some help to you or some help that you can now have to use effectively with other people. I can't thank you enough for your time. You've invested a lot of your very special day. This is Saturday. This is a day where you can freely do some other things, but you chose to come here. I wish I could fund us all to go to Disney World. Well, no, we probably ought to go to Branson. Disney World's probably too much for us. Some of us are kind of older. Maybe we ought to do Branson. And as a matter of fact, we'll just stay at Cheryl Wayne's house. He doesn't live too far from Branson, Missouri. Come on, he says. Yeah. But thank you very much. This church has been so gracious. Tomorrow morning, we're going to have a good time of thought-provoking discussion and study about some really challenging times in our life. So I hope that you're in town and you can come to worship with us tomorrow. Go ahead. If you would, Cliff, thank you very much.
So grateful for your presence today, that you have, as Dean has said, taken time out of your Saturday here and be with us. We're grateful you chose to do that. God bless you, brother, in your ministry. It's most useful, and it's been a particular encouragement to us. That really the work that we're doing with widows today, and the fact that we have a deacon appointed to that position, is a fruit of our attending a previous Widowhood Workshop that Dean was the facilitator for. And so we're grateful for you fellas coming distance to be with us for this event today, and I look forward to what you've got to say tomorrow. It's not often I get to sit in my own auditorium and listen to somebody else preach. And so it's going to be a joy on many levels. But in any case, we should end with a word of prayer. Travis, do you have somebody already selected? All right. Well, if you will, then let's bow in prayer. Father, we're so grateful for the time that we've had together and the encouragement we've gotten from this brother. We pray, Father, that as each of us move through the issues of our life, whether it be widowhood or the struggles of marriage or just the struggles of life, that you'll bless us, Father, that we'll seek out your will and your comfort and your peace to deal with it. We ask, Father, for those of our number that we're aware of that are sick, that you'll bless them and strengthen them. And for those that have traveled good distances to be here, we pray you'll give them a safe journey back home again. In Jesus' name, amen.